Hi guys, it's Paul McArdle here from Head Office. In today's video, I'm going to be looking at the Part 3 and Standards check, particularly in light of the changes that I made to the quick guide to both the Part 3 and in fact the Standards check document. What I'm going to do is, in a moment, I'm going to show you a slide presentation, which is going to give you an overview of the Standards check and the Part 3. And then I'm going to do another set of videos to actually go into a little bit more detail into each of the competencies. But let's first of all start with an overview. And to do that, I'm going to have to share the screen. So bear with me for a minute. There we go. And there we go. So as I said, this is an overview of the DVS, of what the DVSA are looking for really in the ADI Part 3 and Standards check. As part of this test, you really do need to become familiar with these three documents: the National Standard for Driver and Rider Training, the Guidance for Driving Examiners Carrying Out Instruction Tests, ADI-1, and of course the actual marking form itself that the examiners use to assess you on either the Standards check or in fact the Part 3 test. So if you look at each one of these in turn, starting with the National Standards for Driver and Rider Training, there are basically, this is the document that outlines the skills, knowledge and understanding that you need to be either a driving or a riding instructor, or indeed an instructor trainer. There are 6 main units to it. I'm not going to go into each one of those now, but you can actually read them for yourself. The last unit is really for those who are interested in becoming interested in instructor training. This is the document that kicked off the change from the old PST core comps type of Part 3 and Standards check that we used to have many years ago, towards moving towards a much more modern client-centered variant in the way in which we train people to drive, and also the way we train people to become driving instructors. This resulted from this research that was done and these standards that were produced jointly between the DVSA and an educational consultancy body. They came up with a guidance for their examiners so that the examiners knew exactly how to assess a PDI or indeed an ADI during either a Part 3 or a Standards check. Now, the idea was originally just to watch a PDI or an ADI deliver a normal driving lesson, but as you will see, that is now not correct. So although it does say in the guidance to examiners it's a normal lesson, it is in fact now a shorter 45-minute lesson, which came about as a result of COVID, and we'll talk about a little bit later on. It says here the PDI is responsible for the Part 3 and the Standards check lesson, and in particular it's up to them to make sure they are familiar with the area around the test centre and the lesson that they want to give. So it's no good saying, well, I normally give my lessons in this area. It's not fair. I have to go to the test centre. That is what you're going to be examined on. So you are going to have to become familiar. I'm sure if it's your local test centre, you will probably be familiar with the area in any case already, as you'll be taking your learner drivers for tests there. And or if you're doing ADI training, if you're doing ADI training as a driving as an ADI trainer, then you'll also be familiar with it as well. So the pupil they bring, it says in the guidance, can be at any level of ability, but cannot be on the ADI register or past the Part 2 test. While in fact, not only is that the case, but because of COVID and the shortening of the test, you're also now not allowed really to be to bring something that they call a beginner. So the person who you bring has to be at least at the partly trained stage or above. So as it says here, they're going to be checking it based on the criteria in the reporting form that we'll be looking at in a moment, and the national standards for driver rider training, which we briefly mentioned, which you will need to study and become familiar with for yourself. And as I said before, the national standards became about as a result of research that indicated that the new standards for drivers and riders would be best achieved by placing the client at the center of the learning process. So, looking at the actual guidance a little bit further, it's worth noting that the instructional techniques and the old core competencies are still actually required. So, as you're probably already aware, there are 17 competencies that they are looking at, but there actually are previous instructional techniques and older core competencies. And as you can see from the examiner's guidance, the ADI-1, it's telling its examiners the important thing to remember when considering teaching and learning styles is that it is not just about coaching. It is about client-centered learning. Our judgment should be about whether the PDI, ADI can help the learner, can help the pupil to learn in an active way. It then goes on to say, also remember, instruction based around the core competencies and, in fact, instructional techniques used currently is pretty good. We must not throw that away. We are trying to increase the options available to a PDA, ADI, and coaching is a powerful extension of the range of the options. It is not an automatic replacement for any of the existing ones. So the existing ones are still in play. So be careful not to just assume it's simply to do with the 17 new competencies. So what are these old core competencies and instructional techniques? Well, there's an example of the old marking form for Part 3 and the standards check, as it was called then. And you can see that there are what are called 3 core competencies: identification of faults and prevention, fault analysis, and remedial action, or fault correction, as it was also known. The instructional techniques that they expect you to utilize as part of those core competencies is the level of instruction or support that you give. Level of instruction can be used either as an intervention to prevent or minimize risk or danger, but it can also be used as a teaching technique to help the instructor develop, help the pupil develop the necessary skills. Planning, is the lesson structured in a logical way, as you might expect, from simple to complex and so on and so forth. Control of the lesson, this is where if things start to happen and there's a lot of things going on around you, can you keep control of everybody? Can you keep control of the pupil? Can you keep control of the situation? In the old Part 3 and standards check test, this used to be controlling the actual examiner, who would obviously act as a pupil who would try to potentially cause control to be lost. Communication obviously is a natural key skill, and not surprisingly, it was required then, it is now, which is really to be able to communicate in a way that the pupil can understand. As simple as that, really. Q&A technique, question answer technique. This is where you can actually use questions to prompt or encourage the student to draw, if you like, join the dots for themselves and to understand things for themselves. But it can also be used as a way of checking what they understand or what they don't understand at the moment. So it can be used as an assessment tool as well. And it's still required, and it was required, obviously, then. Feedback and encouragement, as you might expect. Again, as any sort of teaching, you need to give some sort of feedback, and to help with motivation and inspiration, you actually have to give encouragement. So there's feedback and encouragement there. Finally, on the instructional techniques is the use of the dual controls, or in fact any of the controls that you can reach easily by hands. In the case primarily in the case of an emergency, or where not to do so would potentially put everybody at risk. So they're the different instructional techniques that they're referring to that are still in play and are still effectively being tested. And the final one is instructional characteristics. It's attitude and approach to the pupil. Again, as we'll see later on, that's also still very much there. It's about being professional. Are you as a instructor being professional, being responsible, being giving a good example to your particular pupil? So these are the things that we're testing. The most important things in the past were these core competencies. And in fact, it almost doesn't matter what you scored in these, as long as you could get a 4, it's a mark from 1 to 6, as long as you get a 4 in each of these boxes in the past, then you would pass either the Part 3 or, in fact, the standards check. So that's shows that these techniques are still there. Furthermore, it goes on to say there is, just to re-emphasize this point, the guidance to the examiner is to make sure the examiners do appreciate this. There is no single correct way to transfer responsibility to them, i.e. to the pupil. And in any case, this is not going to take place instantly. In this context, just that it is unreasonable to expect the pupil to get things right instantly. So it is unreasonable, if you like, to expect the PDI to transfer responsibility instantly. What they're saying by that is that they do not want you to assume that the student, just because you've told them what to do, will do that correctly. They expect that you, especially if it's something new and they've never done it before, they do expect you to provide some level of support or level of instruction as it is known, or as it was known on the old part 3 and the standards check. Hence, for a partly trained pupil, you may remember, because of COVID, because of the changes that they've made, somebody that's less than 20 hours, you will be expected to give some instructional support on any new learning need identified. This may take the form of full instruction, but only on any new bit. Partial instruction, where it's basically not as detailed as the full instruction. Prompts, where you're just giving either prompts to help them, to remind them of what they need to do or what they should do, and or Q&A, which is another way that you can obviously help support students. To transfer responsibility, this is basically where you actually go from a point where the student is doing something with your assistance to being able to do something without your assistance. That's what they mean by transfer of responsibility. So to begin with, they expect you to take some responsibility and then gradually transfer that responsibility to the student for any particular learning task that you might, or exercise that you might be undertaking. So that's all you need to know really about the guidance. They're the main things in the guidance that you need to be aware of, that these existing instructional techniques and core competencies are still being assessed. However, when we look at the new standards check or Part 3 marking report, you can see, in fact, that there are 17 competencies, 4 in lesson planning, 5 in risk management, and 8 in teaching and learning strategies. Now, they were introduced into the Part 3 from the start of 2018. So before 2018, this was not the way the DVSA would assess a Part 3. However, they had assessed standards check, or standards check, as they changed, because it used to be called check test. They changed that name to standards check in 2014. So from 2014, they did use this form to assess existing ADIs who had already passed Part 3, but not new ADIs who were attempting Part 3. As I mentioned earlier, COVID resulted in the test being shortened to 40 to 45 minutes. The instructional techniques that we talked about, the core competencies, are in fact exist within these 17 competencies, as you'll see later on when we look at them as we look at them in some detail. So how are these 17 competencies actually marked on either the Part 3 or the standards check? Well, each of the 17 competencies are marked between 0 and 3, with 0 meaning no evidence of competence being shown, 1 meaning a few elements of competency being demonstrated, 2 meaning competency demonstrated in most elements, and 3 competency demonstrated in all elements. So as you go through the test, this is what the examiner is looking at for each of these 17 competencies. He's deciding, am I going to mark it between 0 and 3? Now, you could imagine to begin with that they're all start off as 3, and depending on how you perform, they can actually be reduced. But it doesn't really work either way. Either it doesn't start with all 0, nor does it start with all 3. It really starts when the examiner starts to think about it at the end of the test. Now, as he goes along, what's going to influence him in this regard is what actually happens. So if we take, for example, the very first competency, goals and needs, did the trainer identify the learner's goals and needs? Well, obviously, there's probably going to be, right at the very beginning of the lesson, there's going to be a discussion about what are the goals for today's lesson. So that will start the process off, and at that point, you might do a really good job, and the goals may be expressed well, reasonably suitable for what information you've gleaned from the student, probably based on what they did in their previous lesson, with a view to what would be a sensible thing to mark, or what would be a smart goal to work on for this particular lesson. So at the beginning, that might happen, and the examiner's thinking 3, thinking definitely 3 for L1. However, these scores are not static; they're quite dynamic. So as the particular lesson goes on, you might be addressing a suitable goal, and maybe some of the other competencies are also suitable at this point and being reasonably demonstrated for the goal that you've established. But as you start to do the lesson, some needs may arise, especially needs to do with safety critical issues. Now, in this case, if you were to ignore those needs, which quite clearly are obvious to the examiner, if not to you as the PDI or the ADI, then all of a sudden, this first competency, which you were thinking of 3, is now possibly thinking about 2, 1, or even 0, depending on how you progress from this point onwards. So you can now notionally, you could be thinking about 1 or even 0. And maybe if you're lucky, then the next iteration round, you will spot the need and you'll actually start to address it. Then all of a sudden, that number may go back from 0 or 1 back up to 2 or 3. So you can see it's very dynamic and fluid in the way in which the marking system works. So it's not static. It doesn't all happen at the beginning or the middle or the end of the lesson. It actually progresses all the way through the lesson, and the assessment is continuous in this particular way. So now let's look at it in a little bit more detail, and particularly let's see how these older core competencies and these instructional techniques are actually incorporated within the 17 competencies, not unlike the instructional techniques were incorporated into the 3 core competencies of the old examination. So let's look at that in some detail. But before we do that, let's just have a look at exactly what the maximum score that you can get. Well, the maximum score you can get is 3 times 1751. Now, to pass this particular assessment, you need to score at least 8 or more in the risk management section. That's R1 to R5. Plus, you need to score at least 31 or more overall. So you could score 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. But if you haven't scored at least 8 in risk management, then you will still fail. So although you've passed the 31 mark, you haven't actually passed the score of 8. So hopefully that gives you an idea how that works. Now, if you're between 31 and 41, then that will equal a grade B, because you probably heard this grade B and grade A pass. And if you score between 43 and 51, that equals a grade A. But remember, you still have to score the 8 or more on risk management in any of those cases. If during the test it becomes apparent to the examiner that he believes the way you're behaving, the way you're delivering your instruction or going about your business, puts either the pupil or a third party in immediate danger, then the examiner may decide to immediately halt the lesson, and that will result in a fail. So let's look now in a little bit more detail exactly, as I start to intimate earlier on, how these competencies integrate, how the old core competencies, and the instructional techniques are encompassed within the 17 competencies. If we look at the old core competencies, or the old competency core process, teaching process that we used to use, it's basically split into three: fault identification and prevention, fault analysis, and remedial action. They were the core competencies of old. And they were the things that you had to do well if you wanted to pass the old Part 3 or the old check test, as it was called many years ago. So we've said that these still exist. These skills and abilities that here are still encompassed within the 17 competencies. So what are they exactly? Fault identification and prevention is being able to identify driving faults and or prevent them on a prevention is better than cure basis. You've got to see it, you've got to say it. So it's no good you identifying the fault if you don't bring it to the student's attention. So that's the first thing. Fault analysis, this is where you have to say, well, why did the driving fault occur? What is it that's missing from the student's performance that needs to be there to make sure that that particular driving fault does not occur again? So hence fault analysis, or SUSIT. That's really about finding what the cause was and making sure that the student agrees with you that it is something that is important, that needs to be dealt with as a matter of priority. In other words, what would it have caused, or what could it have caused if we don't actually deal with that particular driving fault? That's what the fault analysis was all about. Finally, once you've spotted and or prevented the fault, you brought it to the pupil's attention. If you couldn't start talking about it immediately, then you might have had to just simply signpost. We just want you to remember what happened back there. It's a bit busy at the moment. As soon as we get a chance, I want to talk about what's just happened. So in that case, you signpost it, and then at some point you would talk to them in a bit more detail about what it was, what you saw happen, and why you thought it happened as the instructor. And you'll see this has all changed with the client-centered approach. So we then go on to finding out the root cause of it, how we, what the consequences, why we need to deal with it. Then we go on to how we're going to deal with it, how we're going to fix it, what do we need to do, what do we need to change, what do you need to understand, what do you need to do better to be able to make sure that that driving fault doesn't persist and doesn't continue. And then we look to see, well, one of the ways we can make sure that that fault, particularly if it's a safety critical fault, doesn't happen again, is by giving you a certain level of instructional support. If it was at the very early stage, we might go to what's called full instruction. So the next time we do it, so we have to now go on a route where the same problem or issue is likely to rise again, so that we can help the student deal with it effectively, or see if they can deal with it effectively. And one of the things you can do is, if you felt it was really absolutely necessary, but only on the new stuff, only to do with the actual fault itself, you might give them some instruction to make sure that the next time a situation arises, it doesn't happen, basically, because you intervene and let them, you tell them what to do. If you'd chosen to do that the first time round, the next time round you would hope that they would remember what to do, and you'd try to just get away with a prompt, or indeed a question and answer. So you might say, can you remember what we should do in this situation? Then if they gave you the right answer, you would probably just shut up and let them get on with it. If they didn't, then you come back in with a prompt, or partial instruction, as the case may be. Eventually, though, you hope that they're going to be able to do it on their own. So at some point, you do need to let them try and do it independently of you, so that you can see that they can deal with that situation, and that driving fault is no longer likely to happen, irrespective of whether, irrespective of your input. Once they've done it independently, then you can feedback and raise, and then you're back into, right, that's that particular driving fault sorted. Let's now carry on with the lesson until we see something else that we need to work on. In the overall competencies teaching methodology, it would be another driving fault. So you can see this is very instructor driven, or it was very instructor driven, the overall competencies were. However, while all these skills are still relative, all these skills are still relevant, because it's client-centered, we want the student more actively involved in this kind of a process. And we want the process to be far less judgmental and more positive. So it's not about faults, fixing things, sorting out mistakes. It's more about recognizing opportunities for further development, or identifying learning needs, if you like, things where you and the student recognize that ideally something else or something different should have happened to actually make sure that driving fault doesn't materialize next time. So we still have all the steps, but they're actually done in a client-centered way, which means it's less about you identifying the faults or about you analyzing the faults, but it's more about getting your student to analyze the faults and getting your student to suggest an appropriate remedial action and things that they need to do differently in light of what you've discussed to sort out the problem in the first place. Doing it that way, you're more likely to be able to minimize the level of support that you give, because it's their plan, it's not your plan. You know, if you've told them you must do ABC, they're thinking, oh, I must remember ABC. And so you end up telling them. But if they say, what I need to do is ABC, there's a much more chance that they will remember that for themselves. So you may be able to get away with simply checking. You can see the situations coming again where it might arise, where the driving fault might occur. You may simply ask a question. They may say ABC, and you're fine. You let them get on with it. And so it might be as minimal of that in turn, and then next time you would see if you could do it without even asking them the question, because obviously the question is in effect a prompt. So how does this, we said these skills are incorporated into the existing 17 competencies. So exactly where do they appear within those 17 competencies? Well, if we first of all look at the fault identification and prevention, or SAID, as we used to say, to help our PDIs and ADIs memorize the process of old. First of all, R3 is, are you aware of the surroundings and actions of your pupil and what's happening? Well, if you're not aware, then you can't spot or prevent any faults in the first place. So if you didn't spot faults or prevent faults that were preventable, then that would suggest to the examiner that you weren't aware of your surroundings and all the actions of your student. If you never said anything, then there was no intervention which could have prevented the fault, and it wasn't timely or appropriate. Or if you didn't mention it to your pupil and you didn't inform the pupil, then again, you should have said something, and you didn't say anything. So that's where you would start to suffer on R4, if you like. As soon as it's practical, it might not be straight away. If it's not practical, start analysing what happened just there, because it's still too much traffic about, or you've not completely finished the manoeuvre or got around the junction or whatever. Then you would simply signpost it, say, I want you to remember what just happened then, and we'll talk about it later. Or if it was appropriate, you could start talking about it straight away, which takes you to, did you encourage the student to analyze the problem, take responsibility? In other words, without telling them necessarily what the fault was, find out if they knew what the driving fault was. What, why have we stopped? What do you think happened there? What was the issue? Do you think there was an issue? What did you think about it? So that you get them to recognize it, and they might recognize it. Yeah, I should have slowed down. I was going into that junction a bit too fast. Excellent. Now, because they've actually recognized that for themselves, then they're not going to be, they don't need convincing that it wasn't too fast, because they're telling you they're coming too fast. So we can then very quickly go on to say, well, what do you think we might need to do to be able to prevent that in future from happening? Or what do we work on? So then that gives you the opportunity to give them some feedback, because they might not know. If they don't know, then you would have to give them some feedback on a safe critical incident. If you did give them any feedback, or if you say, well, that is a fault because of this, that, and the other, and this, that, and the other is in fact technically incorrect, then it will affect your teaching and learning strategies T4, because the information that you give is technically inaccurate. If you're giving technically inaccurate information, you're almost bound to fail this test. The game is over for you. If you don't know the highway code rule, if you don't know what a driving fault is, if you don't know what the consequences of that driving fault could have been either, or actually was in those circumstances, then you're not cut out to be a driving instructor, which is why you do need to understand best practice. You need to be able to drive best practice. You need to be able to recognize anything that the pupil does that is not best practice, i.e. what you do. And then you need to know, well, if that's best practice, why is it best practice? Why do you do what you do in the way that you do it? That's important. You have to understand all that. If you don't know that, you can't, that doesn't come to mind quickly, then you're going to be stuck. So that's why a lot of the theory that you do and a lot of the study in the background about these things is necessary, because you have to have this core information. Because if you give any crap information, to the student, then straight away your part three is virtually over as soon as you give it technically incorrect information. The student may ask you questions, because at that point they may query you. They might not even think that what you're saying is right. And you've got to deal with those questions in an appropriate way. So that's why T6 is there, because it's a possibility that that would come at that stage in this particular teaching cycle that we used to use in the past. So you can see how it's connected to here. So, why was it a problem? What is the root cause? How should we? How do you think we could deal with it? What do we do? Need to do differently next time? And that's where we then go on to effectively remedial action. So now, what is the plan, man? Now we've talked about it. We've thought about it. What do you think would be the best way to help? First of all, make sure the driving fault doesn't occur. What do you need to do differently? What do you need to know? What do you need to understand? What can I do to help ensure that it's not repeated? And how can I help you get to a point where you can stop that fault occurring again of your own volition without my support, basically? Now, depending on the nature of the problem that you've come across, it will need you to potentially adapt a lesson. You may have been dealing with junctions, but you may discover that they've got real problems with clutch control, which they might not have had last week, but all of a sudden it seems to have reared its head. And all of a sudden you're now going to rethink about your plan. There's no point if this clutch control's not in place, and no point in continuing with the junctions lesson. as such, you need to go and work on the clutch control, which is basically an adaptation of the lesson, L4. So as you try to match what the student needs to help them with their development, you will continually be adapting the lesson. Even though you might be still aiming for the same goal, but there's a certain element of achieving that goal that's not in place, which you need to specifically isolate and work on that for a bit to get that sorted before you can come back to achieving the overall goal. Or, as in the example I gave, it might mean that you need to change your goal completely and look at a different type of goal, which is perhaps to get the clutch control sorted out, and therefore you're then going to start saying, well, what sort of exercises can we do? What activities can we do to help you with this clutch control issue that seems to have appeared, which then means that you're probably going to change your lesson structure and the activities that you're going to conduct. Might even have to change the practice area, but you certainly have to change the route or go to a different place if you're going to practice clutch control versus doing junctions, potentially, although it might just be down a side street where you could do that. So that's why the remedial action, that's where L4, L1, L2, and L3 would come involved. And then if you've decided between you that it would be useful for them to give you some assistance, even if it's just simply to ask a question, like, can you remember what you're going to do at this point next, what you said we're going to do next time? Then you discuss how would you share responsibility, who's going to be doing what? Am I going to give you support? Am I not going to give you support? Or am I going to take responsibility for a task so you can concentrate on a specific area of your development, and I will look after your observations? So whatever it is that you've decided to do, that's where R1 would often come into being, to make sure the student knows what they're going to do when they go around these cycles. If then obviously when you give them directions, they've got to be clear. Instructions have got to be clear. It's got to follow the plan. Am I giving you route directions, or am I letting you decide to go around the route again of your own volition? What have we decided? So clear instructions, clear directions. Of course, if you're not giving clear instructions or confusing instructions or confusing directions, then you're also messing up your teaching style. Teaching style is not meeting the students' needs, so you're going to go down on T1. And especially if you get into the blame game and start slagging off other drivers, then all of a sudden you're going to fall foul of the professional attitude. Similarly, if the student makes derogatory remarks about another person, you need to somehow diffuse that and try to stop them, break any discriminatory behaviour on their part, because it doesn't help them thinking that everybody is an idiot who's on the road. It just gets them worked up, and that's going to be counterproductive. So even if the problem that arose wasn't anything to do with the student and actually was another road user, you can still say, well, the road user did what he did, but what else could we have done to perhaps minimize the consequences of their behavior? And rather than judge their behavior, because we don't know precisely why that behavior has occurred, maybe they've had a bad day, something's happened, maybe they're rushing to hospital because their son or daughters have been told that they've been involved in an accident or something. So that's why the professional attitude and non-discriminatory action could come in. As you praise the student, talk about what you've achieved, what are the learning outcomes, you make them aware, what is it that we're targeting? What is it that we're trying to, what aspect of our performance are we trying to improve? So they understand what is the learning outcome they're trying to achieve. And you may sometimes give an example or a metaphor as to what you mean by that. And then you provide feedback which is timely and appropriate, which is to do more with the teaching and the motivation and inspiring the student. that's where the T5 slightly differs from the R5. The R5 is really feedback to do with the safety critical incident, to do with risk management feedback. T5 is feedback to do more with the learning or teaching strategies that you're applying. So that's how they connect. It might be easier for you to look at it in another way, which is what we've got here. Here's the marking sheet. It's a part 3 marking sheet, but it's just the same as a standards check marking sheet. Remember the old core competencies: fault ID prevention, SAID, analysis, SUSID, and remedial action, SORTID. Still need, and especially in respect to any safety critical incident. So you started your lesson, the safety critical incident arises. Let's say that the original goal that you set for the lesson was great and made sense. So at this point, you've got a 3 for the pupil goal. You've got a 3 for the agreed structure because what the plan sounds sound. Practice area seems appropriate. So at this point, you've got maybe 3s in the first 3 columns and in the examiner's header, so that's a good start. However, the safety critical incident has occurred. So did we see it? Well, if you don't mention it, you don't do anything about it, then clearly you didn't see it. So clearly the trainer in this instance wasn't aware of their surroundings and the pupil's actions. So straight away, at this point now, we've got -3, or if you like, we've got 0. But you can imagine that to some degree, all these boxes start with a 3. And they can go backwards and forwards from a 3 to a 0 and back from 0 to a 3 again. But if you imagine, they all start with a 3. And now all of a sudden, this box, the red box, is now -3, which means it's a 0. Now, if you didn't see it, then the chances are you've not given any verbal, you've not said it, you've not intervened in any way, you've not brought it to the student's attention. So guess what? You've got now -3 was verbal and physical intervention by the trainer timely and appropriate. So you're now at -6. So those 2 3s have now become 0. Was sufficient feedback given to help the pupil understand the potential risk of safety critical? Well, if you never spotted the safety critical incident, you never mentioned it, chances are you're not going to give them any feedback about it either. So guess what? You're going to go down on that. So, and this fraction of moment in time, they're still 3s. These are -3, which means that they're all 0. However, so we've now got at least -9. Now, as you know, if we didn't see it, was the pupil encouraged to analyse problems and take responsibility for learning? Well, they weren't, because you never brought it to their attention. So it's obviously going to affect this teaching and learning strategy, to some degree, as much as possibly -3, but I'm not saying that it's that bad at this stage. Technical information, comprehensive well, it wasn't comprehensive because you didn't say anything about it. So all of a sudden you're now starting to affect this aspect of teaching and learning strategies. Were the queries followed up and answered? Well, no, because you never made the student aware of the problem in the first place, so there wasn't any queries to answer. So you start saying, oh, well, it might impact on that. So remedial action: adapt the lesson to the plan to address the new learning need. I go, well, clearly you're not going to adapt the lesson because you haven't seen the problem in the first place. So all of a sudden now that's -3. So that's 0. And then because this learning need, which is a safety critical fault that's occurred, thus obviously it's a learning need, something needs to be done to so the student needs to learn something to make sure that in future they don't continue with that. Then now that 3 that we said we started off with, even though the initial start of the lesson went really well and the goals were really interesting, the conversation you had with the student were brilliant at the beginning, that's now down to 0 because you didn't address that need. Was the structure appropriate? Now, depending on, again, what that need was, if you carried on with the lesson in the practice area, doing what you're doing at the moment, the examiner might think, well, this is just not really now appropriate, but because you should be really looking at this problem because it's a safety critical situation, safety critical need, and that should take priority. So you should be really looking at doing something to address that problem, but you're not. So as a consequence, the lesson structure or the plan is no longer appropriate. So you've got minus for that. And although I'm not going to do it on this occasion, it could even be that, depending on how serious it was, it could be even that the practice area now is no longer suitable to address that learning need. But on this case, I'm deciding that it's the learning area is still suitable to address the need, but it's not been addressed. So now you're at least minus 21, which, as you realize, you can only score 51. So now you're down to 50. So you are at this point, you're now failing, you're now losing, you're now not satisfied. Because you're not dealing with what the student needs, then clearly was teaching style suited to the student's learning style and current ability? No, because their ability obviously is lacking in this one area, and you've done bugger all about it. So straight away it's going to impact on that. Was pupil given time? No, because you never mentioned anything to them. So if there's an aspect of their ability which needs to be addressed as to teaching, then again they needed to be given some appropriate feedback about what to do about that. How do I improve my ability? Well, that wasn't done, so it's going to impact on that. And because there was no learning outcome, you never clarified what the learning outcome should be, because you never noticed, you never realized that there was a learning outcome that needed to be addressed. So you can see that it notionally, all of a sudden, impacts on all those teaching and learning strategies, which then were directions and instructions give it clear and a good time. Well, it might impact on those depending on what was expected. So at this point, it looks like it's the end of the game. However, as I did say to you earlier, you can imagine that they all start at 3 and they can go down to 0, and they can actually come back up to 3 again. However, once you've got down to 0, once the examiner is thinking, "Oh, this is not very good," you've missed out a big safety, especially if it was a big safety critical thing that you missed completely, then chances of you coming back from that are not likely. If it's not such a safety critical incident, but it is something that you really should have dealt with, but it's not really caused a major issue, and then you've gone on to spot it subsequently. So you didn't spot it first time, but you did spot it second time, and then you started to deal with it, and then you started to address that need. All of a sudden, we were addressing the need now. So from a 0, I can't leave it as 0 now, because we now got a need doing. So it starts in the examiner's mind. He's starting to think, oh yeah, okay, right, he is recovering. He's actually going. And then if you do everything else well, then it is possible to get yourself back up to the point where you need 31 and at least 8 within your risk management. So that's why the see it, say it, suss it, and sort it are so impossible and so important. So we've looked at the traditional teaching cycle that we used: fault identification, prevention, fault analysis, and fault correction. Let's look at a more modern approach, which is coaching, which is also mentioned, and let's see how that relates to the 17 competencies and how it can potentially work as part of a learning strategy, because coaching is really a learning strategy rather than a teaching strategy, because the idea behind coaching is that you get the student to recognize the performance issues, and you get the student to decide for themselves how they might best address those performance issues, and come up with a plan. Naturally, you're going to guide them in that if you think whatever it is they're suggesting might not work, then you would actually give them more information to sort of help them recognize for themselves that this isn't going to work, and therefore they need to redress that. So coaching, first thing, identify what the student wants or need to do to achieve the next learning goal or need, and establish, first of all, why it's important rather than for them to achieve it next. Is it safety critical, for example? So even though it might not be the student's goal, if there's a safety critical issue arise, then you need them to accept this as their new goal because it's safety critical, which means that you're not going to do that unless you can actually help them recognize why it is safety critical, and hence why it needs to be dealt with as a priority, and why this may now need to replace the original goal, or at least temporarily put that goal on suspension while we deal with it, and then we can come back to the goal that we started out with in the first place. So so that's how we would in the coaching, you do it, try not to tell them why it's safety critical. You actually try to get them to see what the factors are and recognize it for themselves, which means that that's not going to happen if the learning step is so great. There is no way they can actually figure things out for themselves. So if you're going to use coaching, you have to do it in small, easy steps. The challenges and the progression has to be small so that they can actually join the dots themselves without necessarily you telling them everything that they need to know or do. So if it's a small progression, they have to really, it has to be a very clear goal that they understand, and they have to know when it's achieved. Otherwise, how can they assess when they've been successful? So they have to do that. You have to establish whether it's realistic. This is where we talked about the small easy step. It has to be something that is achievable from where they are with the skills and the knowledge and the understanding they have at this point in time. If it's not, then you need to make the student aware that you can't run before you can walk, and you can do that simply by questioning them, saying, well, what can you do now? What do you need to be able to do, and how big a gap is that between what we need to do and what you can do now? Is that gap not a little too large, and therefore perhaps we need a little stepping stone? We need to do something in between. Perhaps we need to isolate something and work on that first, and then come back to the bigger step that you're wanting to achieve. So that's what the realistic bit. So once you've actually got a goal that's smart, as we'll talk about that in more detail, what a smart goal is, but that's basically what you're doing. You're making sure the goal's smart. You then need to discover what is preventing them, the obstacles from realizing the goal. What is it that they need that they don't have, basically, that ideally they need to have to actually achieve the goal? Is it lack of experience, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of skill, lack of self-belief, lack of belief in you or the process, or indeed, is it down to their current emotional or physical state? Because maybe the reason the goal might have appeared realistic on first approach, but then as you took in more detail, you realize that their current emotional or physical state means that it's probably not something they can do at this moment in time. So that's just an example of all the things that might need to be recognized by the student to help them decide what it is that they need to overcome. Then once you know what it is you need to overcome, then we start talking about, well, how can we overcome those things? In other words, from the growth point of view, it's what are the options? What options do you have to overcome these obstacles, including adjustments to the learning tasks? So you can actually break a skill down into sub-skills and tackle each sub-skill. That might be one option open to you. You might be able to find a simpler version of what it is you're trying to do, which you can't do at this point in time, so you can gradually build up your skill. Or you may decide that you can tackle it, but you need some instructional support. So, you know, what is that support? You know, how may I help you? What option? In this case, we're talking about instructional support, which is not ideal from a coaching perspective, because that's not from the student. You're going to supply this support. But you've got to accept the reality of the situation. There may be a junction that you think is simple enough, but it's not as simple as you would like. And really, you'd have to drive 20 miles to find the junction that you'd ideally like to help the person develop their skills on, but it's not there. So the other alternative is to use some instructional skills, some instructional support to help ease the task, which could be just to actually give them support in terms of telling them what to do and when, or give them prompts, or guide them, or help them out should they need it. Or it could even be to take part of the responsibility for some of the task of dealing with the junction. So you could say, well, I'm going to be the primary person responsible for the observations. So I'll tell you whether to go or stop, because I want you to, say, for example, concentrate on getting the rolling clutch, getting to first gear and moving off smoothly with your feet. So that means that you've taken that response. So they're all different ways and options of actually helping the student to, if you like, make the task achievable, because ideally every task they should be successful at doing it. And then you make the task a little bit more difficult, which could be to remove the support, or it could be to make the task more difficult by adding some degree of difficulty, additional difficulty to the task that isn't in the, which if you're doing junctions, it could be, first of all, turning left on simple junctions, and then it might be to turn right. Then it might be to look at some junctions that have tight corners, some junctions that are on gradients, some junctions that have poor visibility on the way in or on the way out, some, and so on. So, you know, you always start off with the simple that's easy and progress forward. That's what you're always trying to do. So we then, as part of the way forward, is decide exactly what you're going to do, which options. So you, first of all, you have like a brainstorming session where you decide what all the options are and how you might do it, and then you finalize what it is you're going to do. And it's the way forward. That's what you've decided between the pair of you. You decided this is what you're going to do. R1 is there. You've got T2, T3, T6. They're the teaching and learning strategies. They're more learning strategies in this case than teaching. And R2 is the level of support that you're going to do. So that's the instructions you're going to give. And that's obviously the awareness. And then R1 is how we're going to share responsibility, and so on. Establish whether they will make it happen. In other words, are they committed to it? Do they believe they can do it? Do they believe the plan will work, basically? So you might just say, so are you happy? Do you want to have a go at this? Are you ready? Shall we give it a go? Shall we do it? Bang. That's it. So the will is then done. So you then undertake the action plan, the activity. And you can see where the other competencies are likely to come in. This is where all the competencies are. Then at some point, you would reflect on the outcome. Either on the move if possible, but more often than not when you're using coaching, it usually requires you to be stationary, especially if you're not making much use of instructional support or or separating tasks. And then you repeat the above. So you can see that that is not in a way that dissimilar from the teaching cycle that we looked at. The teaching cycle is a bit more retrospective, where you're saying, let's let problems happen and then we'll solve them. This here is the opposite, where you're trying to anticipate the problems, the obstacles, and try to fill in the gaps before you even attempt it. And so that's what the difference is. With this one, you're always trying to ensure that you're always successful on the task that you're doing. With the other one, you're basically saying, well, we'll let the task fail and then we'll try and sort it out afterwards, which is why it's retrospective, whereas coaching is the opposite. It's proactive, effectively. So that's the difference between the two styles. So let's have a look at the changes. We've already alluded to these changes about what the standards check is. It's no longer a normal lesson. It was changed. They made a change to Part 3 and standards check test format due to COVID, basically to minimise the car being stood still and letting windows be open, and to minimise the transmission of COVID. They decided to stop, not to do the first bit. Often where you have a briefing, you're talking to the student, so you're stood still, you're not moving, there's a lot of talking going on. Not a good idea for transmitting COVID. So that was the idea of actually missing out that bit at the beginning, so that you just really concentrated on the move bit, which is why the test was cut down to 45 minutes, of which they're hoping to get about 40 minutes of actual on the road practice in some shape or form. And because they did this during the COVID period, they analysed the results of what they'd done, and they checked with all the examiners what they felt about it. And the outcome, this is exactly what they stated. They felt it was shown to be enough time to properly demonstrate all the required competencies and the appropriate instructional techniques. And there was no evidence to support it would result in a detriment to the standards that they were assessing. Examiner feedback confirmed that the shorter test had led to a more focused assessment, which is interesting because obviously the main reason for the DVSA being established was to make sure that only people who were safe to give driving tuition were allowed on public roads. And so their first objective is the safety. So they realized that by concentrating on the moving bit, it actually was focusing on the aspect of an instructor's performance that they were particularly important, was a priority to them. And learners must be at a partly trained stage. This again is to minimize the amount of stationary instruction. And again, this sitting still talking about a problem or doing a maneuver isn't a particularly risky thing to do. Whereas when you're on the move, when you're in partly trained, you're in busier traffic, you're dealing with more complex road situations, or junctions and the like, then that's where the dangers exist. So using a partly trained student makes sense because it assesses the instructor's ability to control lesson in a moving environment, which is in essence what the core of what the DVSA has always really been about in terms of controlling the ADI register. It's why the ADI register was set up in the first place, to say how can we make sure that people who are using the public roads to teach people to drive are not dangerous. There you go. So this is why, quite understandably, they felt this new test, better reflected that. It also incidentally helps out in that because it's a shorter test, and because, as you know, with COVID, there's a big backlog of tests. It does help to make them a little bit more efficient in terms of helping with that backlog. But that's not the main reason that they're doing it. Is because they felt it actually gave them a better medium for testing the students, the instructor's suitability as a person safe to do tuition on the public roads. So that's new. That's the way it is now. So it's, as far as we know, that's going to be permanent. It's going to continue that way going on. So how do you get ready for this Part 3 standards check? Because of what I've just said, it isn't a normal lesson. So you're not really just giving a normal lesson. And you're not given necessarily a normal lesson in the area where you would normally give the lesson. You're actually going to the test centre. So you do need to think carefully, well in advance, about the topics and all the skills development that might best be suited to the practice areas around the test centre or en route to it. So that's the first thing you need to think about and consider. So you do need to look at your test centre. I mean, you probably know your test centre area, but you really do need to understand the area around it and what the possibilities are. You need to make sure your pupil is comfortable driving in that area. So you might need a couple of lessons beforehand in the area just to be sure, so that there's no chance of anything in that area causing the pupil difficulties because it's unfamiliar for some reason, especially if there's something unusual in the area that they've never come across before. Then, you know, for example, let's say they've never come across trams, but near the test centre there is a tram track. That's something that they've never come across before, so you definitely need to make sure that they were aware of that. Make sure the student is at a level to cope with Q&A on the move, ideally. You know, it might not always be possible because sometimes students, even though they drive quite well, can be easily distracted by questions. So if that's the case, then you may have to decide that maybe he's not the right student for you to take, particularly if you want to start doing, you know, if you want to do fault analysis on the move, then ideally they need to be able to cope with Q&A on the move. In other words, if you're looking at the LDC program, you're looking for the control skills development to be completed. So all those lessons related to developing control skills, i.e. becoming one with the vehicle, ideally need to be completed. So they're not having problems controlling the car at this stage. And they're possibly well into the road skills development, if not even into you know, the traffic skills development, depending on the practice areas in the test centre. Again, if the test centre is in a busy city centre location, then really they need to be in the traffic skills stage, not in the basic road skills stage, for example, if you're going to use that student at that test centre. Make sure you know how you might take a step backwards or indeed forwards, utilising the practice area at your disposal in and around that test centre. So, you know, you may be surprised on the day they might get nervous when the examiner gets in the back. So things that they were doing all right a minute ago, all of a sudden, see they're not doing all right because they've obviously got a bit nervous, and that's maybe affecting their ability to control the car, etc. So what you just planned to do, and you just told the examiner this is what you're going to do next, you may be going to have to adapt fairly quickly and adjust just what you're doing. And you need to know, is there required to set of roads in your area, in this area that you can go to, so that you can help the student overcome their nerves and then bring them gradually back onto track, onto the roads that you had been working on just before you went into the test. And now all of a sudden the student seems to be having difficulty dealing with. So you've seen their body language, you're responding to it, you're obviously making the student aware of it, of what you've seen, you're making the examiner aware, and you're actually adapting the lesson accordingly. So you need to know, how can I take a step back? What can I do? If for some reason it's a problem, what can I do about it? Equally, I mean, you would have hopefully tested the routes in the area beforehand to make sure you know if there's any roadworks or things like that already there. Or indeed forward, if the student you know, progresses much more quickly than you anticipated, then you may need to find an area. How can you increase the challenge? You know, how can you move them on? You know, either do you need to move on to a completely new subject or a new skill? If they finish it, even if you didn't expect them to finish it, but they did, then, you know, what's available to you? What can you do? So you've got to be ready for both. This shows you really how dynamic a driving lesson is. You can't have a completely foolproof, pre-planned step-by-step driving lesson that you can give in a rote fashion. It doesn't exist. You have to respond to what you see and what you know. And that's the difference. That is the big difference between, say, giving a lesson in a school, in a classroom, where everything can be nice and planned and you can actually neatly deliver the lesson as you anticipated, versus having a planned lesson for driving. Planned lesson for driving is really a little bit like a framework, which is approximately targeted at the student, but it doesn't get fully targeted to the student until you see how they're performing on the day. And then you have to go up or down depending on what you see. You start the lesson before you arrive at the test centre, up to 30 minutes earlier, but not too long, otherwise the student might be fatigued by the time you get to the driving test centre, which you don't want that. And you do a review or reflection with the student before the examiner gets in to say, where are we so far? In that 30 minutes, you might have adapted the lesson from what you originally said you were going to do 30 minutes ago. And that's perfectly fine. If that's what's needed, then that's what's needed. And you do that, you agree with what you're dealing with next and what the next plan is for the next chunk of learning. We'll talk a little bit more about chunks of learning later on. And you can decide what to work on next. And then when you meet the examiner, they will probably want to know how many lessons of tuition the pupil has had so far, so they can determine for their exam paper. You may have noticed when we saw the exam paper earlier that it says, is he a partly trained learner? Is he a trained learner? Is it full license holder, or is it full license holder experienced? We don't have beginner because that's not permitted. So although the form has a beginner, the beginner is not really an option. So the examiner is going to determine which of those. And the reason he needs to know that is because that will set in his mind what level of support or level of instruction, as it used to be called, as an old instructional technique, is probably likely to be most appropriate for this particular student. So it does have a bearing on what you're doing. If it is a part 3 test, then you may also be asked, they may also ask to see your PDI skills development logbook, which LDC obviously provide you with, to show you are following a proper course of training and by whom, and also whether the person guiding you is in fact on audit. Most of our trainers are, certainly our senior trainers at head office are audit. Briefly recap what the pupil hoped to achieve at the start of the lesson, even if you had to adapt it, and say that you had to adapt it and why, and where you are now in respect to the lesson goals agreed, and or newer goal or adapted goals, the case may be, subsequent learning needs you've identified, and basically what you're going to address now in the next 5 to 8 or 10 minutes, next 5-10 minutes. But you've only got 3 minutes to do that, so that's why you will have discussed this more fully with your student before the examiner gets in, so you can just give them a brief recap. Obviously, still talk to the student. Again, don't exclude the student just because you know you've already talked to the student about it, but just still involve them again for the examiner's benefit. So it doesn't look like you're just talking to the examiner. And then describe how you intend to address those learning needs and achieve the goals in the remaining 40 minutes, starting with the next burst of planned activity, i.e. a chunk of learning, which we'll talk about chunks later. Consider using a more traditional directed instructional whole core comps fault assessment approach, just much more client-centered, as we said, whereby you're actively involving the student in all those stages, and you're not using as much judgmental language. You're trying to avoid fault correction, mistakes, and all that jazz, rather than a coaching non-directive approach, where you might be using solely discovery learning along with stationary reflective discussions. Well, the examiners, if you remember from reading the guide, they are expecting instruction to be shown. So you couldn't really focus your learning strategy, because that's what it would be, as opposed to a teaching strategy, purely on an holistic coaching model, because the examiner wouldn't be happy with that, simply because if the student was achieving everything that you told them, that you discussed, they'd think it was actually a pre-planned lesson, when in fact it might not be a pre-planned lesson, but it might look like that to the examiner. So you can use a hybrid approach of coaching with direct instruction, and that's what we would recommend you use, because it is the easiest one to do. Trying to focus heavily on a coaching non-directive approach is difficult and is really quite an advanced skill. So, and it's just not needed, and it's not necessary, and it can actually disadvantage you. So, you know, for your part 3 or indeed standards check, I wouldn't focus that much on that particular methodology. Remember what competencies the DVSA really want to see: the instructor's ability to control the lesson in the moving environment. Make sure you know the area around your test centre, and make sure the last chunk of learning is the drive back to the test centre. So the activity of actually going back to the test centre is a little chunk of learning. And like all the chunks of learning, they've got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they've got to have a purpose. So you've got to state what that purpose is. So make sure you check the time, keep the time, so that you know, and also how far you are. Know at any time how far you are from the test centre, so you know how quickly you can get back to the test centre, and potentially what route you might take. So upon returning to the test centre, you'd wrap up the session, giving a quick overview of what you've achieved today, particularly in the last 40 minutes, to show the examiner that progress has been made. Just summarise to hammer home that this and this and this is where improvements have been made in the final 2 minutes, because that's all that's allowed. You can do the full end of lesson process that we talk about in the LD system when the examiner has gone. So the examiner will then reflect on your performance, give you your score. Yeah, complete the full end of lesson procedure as you see fit once the examiner has left. So that's how you can do it. So that's as much as I wanted to say really about giving this introduction to the test and how you should cope with the test and what you need to do to actually make sure you're fully prepared for the test. In the next step, in the next video, I'm going to actually start to look in more detail at the individual competencies. I'm going to look in more detail at exactly how a lesson is structured, and what parts. We talked about learning chunks. We'd say, well, what exactly are these learning chunks and how do they work? But that's for another time. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you. Well, I won't see you, but I hope you will see me in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.